I first heard about the house on Farm Road, 1918, from a Caldwell County deputy who wouldn't give his name. He'd called late on a Sunday. The kind of voice that sounds like it's speaking from the other side of a sleepless night. He said there was a property outside Lockhart that nobody wanted to claim. No deed. No owner. No one paying taxes for almost 15 years, but it kept showing up on missing person maps. The dispatcher had stopped sending units after dark because patrols were coming back shaken, saying the house smelled wrong. That's what got my attention. I'm not a cop. I'm a freelance journalist who writes about places that make normal people walk faster. My readers like the kind of stories that feel like they could be about the house next door. I drove out from Austin the next morning. The road was little more than a scar of gravel slicing through dry pasture. The sun hung like a dull coin. Every few miles there was an old cattle gate and a mailbox without a name. Then the asphalt turned to dirt and the GPS map bled white, as if the system itself didn't want to go farther. The house appeared out of a line of mesquite trees, 2 stories, grey clapboard skin, roof missing half its shingles. It looked like it had been dropped there by a storm that forgot to take it back. The porch was sagging. There were children's shoes on the steps, fossilized with dust. Inside smelled of rot and ammonia. I pushed the door with my shoulder and heard glass slide across the floor. The living room still had furniture, couch, TV stand, framed photograph of a family whose faces had been scratched out with something sharp. I took pictures for my notes. The air tasted like copper. In the kitchen, the refrigerator door was open, its shelves stripped bare except for a single mason jar filled with cloudy water. A strip of masking tape on the lid read, the 19th of July, 09. There were claw marks on the wallpaper near the back door. Human, not animal. 5 fingers dragging downward. I measured them with a pen. The span was almost exactly my own. I spent an hour documenting and was about to leave when I heard something upstairs. Not movement exactly, more like a weight shifting in slow rhythm. The way a house breathes when it settles. Still, it was enough to make me freeze in the doorway. When I went up, each step groaned loud enough to feel alive. At the top landing, there were 3 doors. 2 open, 1 closed. The open rooms were empty except for debris and the smell of rain, even though it hadn't rained in weeks. The closed door had a padlock hanging loose from a bracket. The lock was unlatched but still hooked, as if someone had removed the shackle and then hung it back for show. I hesitated, then pushed it open. I hesitated, then pushed it open. The room beyond was smaller than it should have been. A nursery maybe, once. The wallpaper showed faded blue stars. The window had been boarded from the outside. There was a crib, and inside it, stacked neatly, were cassette tapes, dozens of them, each labeled with a date. The newest read the 8th of March, 21. I hadn't expected anything recent. I picked up the top tape and held it to the light. The reel was wound tight, the plastic case cloudy with fingerprints. A portable recorder sat on the shelf beside the crib. Batteries corroded, but still there. That's when I noticed something else. The floor under the crib was cleaner than the rest of the room. Scrubbed raw, as if someone had been on their knees there for hours. There were faint brown streaks between the boards. I didn't need a forensics kit to guess what they were. I bagged the tapes with the care of habit and stepped back into the hall. The air felt heavier, like the house was holding its breath again. When I reached the stairs, I saw fresh footprints on the dusty steps, bare feet. Small, pointing upward behind me. I left the house fast, locked the door, and drove until I found cell service. When I played the first cassette later that night in a motel room, the recording began with a woman's voice saying my name. I came to Corsicana because of a body that was never found. The sheriff's department called it a cold case, the kind of file they kept in a cardboard box with a coffee ring on the lid. The missing man's name was Leon Dorsey, 32, HVAC tech, divorced. He'd stopped returning calls one August morning. His truck was discovered 6 months later parked behind a condemned duplex off Highway 287, keys in the ignition, doors locked from the inside. I wasn't interested in Leon at first. I was chasing a different lead. A rumor that the duplex had been used by a squatter who recorded people sleeping. When I pulled up, the structure looked like something half erased, roof sagged, windows boarded, grass tall as my waist. Inside, it was hotter than outside. The air stank of mildew and something sour, like meat left in the sun. The living room walls were covered with Polaroids, hundreds. Each photo showed the same bedroom, from the same corner angle, a narrow bed, a nightstand, and a person sleeping on their side. The photos weren't old. Some were dated only months earlier. In every one, the sleeper's face was turned away except in the last row, where a man, Leon, looked directly into the camera, eyes open. I thought it was staged until I looked closer. The eyes weren't focused. The pupils were filmed grey, the kind of dullness you see only once. The kitchen held a single chair, centered under the light fixture. On the table were dozens of cassette microtapes labeled with the same handwriting as the Polaroids. Night 1. Night 2, after. The county lab later said the voice on those tapes was Leon's. He spoke in a calm, slurred tone, describing each breath he took, counting minutes between creaks in the ceiling. By night 14, his speech changed. He began describing footsteps, circling his bed, a door opening even though he'd nailed it shut. By night 17, the counting stopped. Only breathing remained. 2 sets of lungs, one steady, one too shallow. They never found Leon's body, but there were fibers of carpet, matching his apartment embedded in the seams of that duplex floor. The assumption was he'd move himself there, some breakdown, maybe drugs, but the photos told another story. One detail kept me awake later. In the earliest Polaroids, the shadow of the photographer stretched across the bed. Each night the shadow shrank, as though the photographer was kneeling closer and closer, until the final image, where the shadow vanished completely, as if the camera were resting on the pillow beside him. The building was demolished in 2023. The sheriff's office burned the contents, citing biohazard concerns. Still, sometimes I see the photos reposted online. Same bedroom, same bed, different sleepers. None of the posters know where the images come from. I was driving through the Texas hill country when I first noticed the ranch house. State Route 29 winds through that area like it's avoiding something. The sign said private property, but the gate was open, swinging with a slow creak. Locals in Llano had started whispering about the place a year prior. An old cattle ranch, abandoned since the owner disappeared. In '97, they said it wasn't the ghost. Stories that were strange. It was the smell, and the way animals stayed away. I parked my truck at the edge of the dirt driveway. The house was 2 stories of weathered wood, grey and cracked, roof sagging. Windows were broken or missing. Inside, the floors were littered with debris, broken furniture, rusted tools, and layers of dust like the house hadn't exhaled in decades. I started in the main living area. The smell hit me first, wet iron like blood long dried. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, until I realized it was coming from under the floorboards. I pried one up with my crowbar. Beneath was a shallow pit, and inside were dozens of small, rusted tin boxes, all sealed but decayed. Inside each box, a single human tooth, carefully cleaned, polished. Some had traces of enamel still clinging. Some had writing etched into them. Names, dates, initials. The oldest read MS 1963. The newest, RD 1994. I didn't hear anything when I moved to the next room, but the air thickened. Upstairs, there was a master bedroom, empty except for a large wardrobe. I opened it and found clothing arranged meticulously on the floor, not folded, but lined in precise rows. Each item had dried stains on the inside seam, blood, sweat, bodily fluids. The wall behind the wardrobe had scratches, deep and parallel, like someone had clawed at it from the other side. The pattern repeated for over 6 feet. In the attic, it got worse. Boxes stacked floor to ceiling. Journals, letters, receipts, from dentists and morticians. A notebook described in chilling detail how the ranch's owner, a man named Harold Keene, collected items from travelers, workers, and anyone who passed through. He didn't kill them, he claimed, but he documented their routines, their secrets, even how they slept. He wrote about preserving life in parts and removing evidence from memory. When I tried to leave, The front door slammed shut. Not by the wind. It was deliberate, heavy, like someone had been waiting. My hand shook as I forced it open. I didn't return to the ranch after that day. The local sheriff later told me the ranch was demolished after a storm in 2022, revealing a hidden cellar under the kitchen floor. Inside, the remains of a man were found, wrapped in canvas, with teeth missing, some of them matching the ones in the tins upstairs. Nobody ever knew who Harold Keene's last victim was, or how many boxes he had buried in secret. The house no longer exists, but the horror lingers in the hill country. Ranchers tell me their cattle won't pass the site. Dogs howl at dusk, and sometimes, when the wind hits the trees right, they swear they hear scratching from under the ground. I first heard about the house on Walker Street from a local bail bondsman. He didn't want his name used, said the cops had already made a mess of it. He only mentioned one thing: you don't go in there alone. Of course. That was exactly why I went. San Angelo isn't a big town, but it has pockets that feel like they've been forgotten by time. Walker Street is one of them. Rows of abandoned clapboard houses, peeling paint, rusted mailboxes, all sitting under the relentless West Texas sun. The house in question was at the end of a cul-de-sac, a squat two-story structure with a porch that leaned forward, as if it was straining to see anyone who approached. I parked my car on the cracked asphalt and approached on foot. The air smelled like wet dust and old tobacco. The front door had been removed entirely. Inside, sunlight slanted through broken blinds, illuminating furniture coated in years of grime. The living room had a couch ripped open, cushions torn, stuffing spilling across the floor like straw in a barn. On a low coffee table were dozens of Polaroids, all of the same woman. Not glamour shots, just her sleeping, sitting at a table, staring out the window. The dates on the back spanned nearly a decade. I moved to the kitchen. The smell hit me immediately, ammonia mixed with rotting food. The refrigerator was closed, heavy with rust. When I pried it open, there was nothing inside but a single small box. Inside the box were clippings from local newspapers, dozens of them, each describing missing persons, cases, people who had vanished in the area over the last 15 years. The handwriting on the clippings matched the scrawled notes I found on the wall of the living room. The wall itself was disturbing. Someone had written in pencil, over and over, almost obsessively, "She watches, but does not see. She hears, but does not speak. She waits." I heard a noise upstairs, a soft creak of floorboards. I wasn't alone. Not entirely. My pulse raced. Slowly, I climbed the staircase, which groaned under each step. At the top, I saw 2 rooms. The first had been converted into a makeshift bedroom. There was a bed, unmade, and the sheets were dark with stains I didn't want to identify. On the dresser were dozens of cassette tapes, each carefully labeled with a date and a name. I picked up one and read, the 14th of July, 2012, ME. The other room at the end of the hall was the worst. It had been turned into what looked like a shrine. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, pinned with thumbtacks. Each one was of the same woman, but older in each successive photo. The floor was littered with small, personal objects, hairbrushes, shoes, nail clippings, even worn socks. On a small chair in the center of the room sat a journal. I opened it. The entries were erratic at first, daily notes about groceries, the weather, mundane details, but soon they became darker. The author, a man named Thomas Keller, detailed watching the woman, learning her routines, knowing when she slept, what she ate, even what she dreamed. The writing turned almost manic. He described leaving items for her to find, noting her reactions, testing her patience, cataloging her fears. The last entry was smudged, as though written in a rush. She knows too much now. I cannot stop her from leaving. I cannot leave her to speak. I must wait for her to sleep. I stepped back. The weight of the room pressed against me. I noticed the floorboards were uneven, as if something heavy had been dragged across them. My instinct screamed at me to leave immediately, and I did. Later, when I returned with law enforcement, they found what I feared. A crawlspace under the floorboards contained skeletal remains, partially clothed, wrapped in decades of fabric. Identification was impossible without DNA. They also recovered the cassette tapes, which when played, recorded whispers, breathing, and one faint voice, just barely audible, pleading for help. The Walker Street house was demolished the following year. Local children still dare each other to go to the cul-de-sac at night, claiming they can hear whispers through the broken fences. One thing is clear: someone spent decades obsessing over another human life, cataloging every small detail, until that life was ended and hidden. The remnants left behind were a chilling record of methodical, patient cruelty, the kind of horror that doesn't need ghosts to terrify. Even now, months after the demolition, I can't stop thinking about the Polaroids, the journal, and the faint pleading voice on those tapes. Some houses are empty, but the darkness left behind inside them lingers, far longer than the walls themselves. I first learned of the cottage on Lake Buchanan from a retired park ranger named Hank, who still patrolled the northern edges of Burnett County. He didn't give much detail at first, just a warning: you go up there alone, and you'll find something that'll make you question what people are capable of. That's all it took. The cottage sat at the end of a narrow dirt road, almost entirely concealed by a thick stand of mesquite and live oak. The air smelled faintly of lake water and decay. From the road, it looked abandoned, windows caked with grime, shutters hanging crooked, roof shingles missing. But as I approached on foot, I noticed something odd: faint footprints pressed into the dirt, bare and small, leading toward the side door. Inside, the cottage was dim. Dust swirled in the sunlight filtering through broken blinds. The living room smelled of mildew and damp wood. But there was something else, a faint metallic tang that made my stomach turn. The furniture had been moved haphazardly. Chairs tipped over, a sofa ripped open. The walls were covered in old newspaper clippings, mostly local crime reports. But someone had scrawled notes in pencil on top of the clippings. The handwriting was shaky, obsessive. They come and go. They never leave. I watch, I wait. In the kitchen, the refrigerator was empty except for a small, unmarked jar. Inside, a thick, dark substance had settled at the bottom. I didn't touch it. On the counter, there was a stack of notebooks, each filled with meticulous entries, documenting people who had rented cottages around the lake over the past 20 years. Names, dates, what they ordered for dinner, where they slept, how long they stayed. The final notebook was open to a page dated less than a month prior. I went upstairs, each step creaking like a warning. There were 2 bedrooms. One was empty except for a bed frame with no mattress. The other was worse. Clothes were scattered across the floor, carefully arranged in lines. Shoes, socks, underwear, even hairbrushes were stacked in neat little piles. On the wall, someone had drawn a large diagram of the lake, marking paths and cabins with dates and times. At the center of the diagram, a single cottage was circled repeatedly. On a small table in the corner, I found a series of audio recorders, still intact. I pressed play on one. The recording was faint, distorted, but I could make out a man's voice describing in chilling detail the habits of a couple who had rented a nearby cabin. He noted when they woke, what they ate, how they slept. He described listening to them through thin walls and imagining what it would be like to control their lives completely. The voice became erratic near the end of the recording, almost screaming, repeating over and over, "They can't leave. They can't leave. I must make them stay." I didn't hear anyone physically in the house, but the air felt alive with presence. I noticed scratches in the floorboards near the door, small gouges as if someone had knelt there for hours, digging their fingers into the wood. I left quickly, locking the door behind me. Later, I learned the cottage had been used by a man named Calvin Hayes, who disappeared from Burnett County 2 decades ago. Investigators found no trace of him. Some locals speculated he had drowned in the lake, but that didn't explain the obsessive journals, the recordings, or the footprints leading to the door. The cottage eventually collapsed during a violent storm. Nothing was recovered inside, but park rangers still report strange occurrences, footsteps echoing at night. Objects moved from where they left them, fleeting glimpses of a figure standing near the lake, and some of the older locals swear the smell of ammonia, and iron returns. When the wind blows a certain way. Lake Buchanan looks peaceful in the daylight, serene and calm. But the abandoned cottage shows that the kind of darkness humans can create doesn't fade with time. It just hides, waiting for someone to come close enough to feel it again. The Hollow Street House first came to my attention when a call came from the Tyler Police Department. A local teen had been found wandering near the outskirts of town, babbling about a room that watches you. The officer who responded said the description matched an abandoned house at the end of Hollow Street, a decrepit structure that had been empty for nearly 20 years. Residents avoided the street. Even the dogs wouldn't cross it. I arrived in Tyler on a late August afternoon. The sun was still high, burning the tops of mesquite trees. Hollow Street itself was barely more than a cracked asphalt line, weeds forcing their way up through every fissure. The house stood at the dead end like a sentinel. 2 stories of peeling white paint, warped boards, and a roof that sagged under its own age. Windows were covered with sheets of plywood, but I could see through cracks, furniture scattered, shadows crawling along the walls. I parked a few yards from the house and approached cautiously. The air was thick with heat and an unmistakable stench of decay, metallic and sharp, like iron left in the sun. The front door was warped but unlocked. I pushed it open, the hinges whining in protest. Inside, the living room was coated with layers of dust. Broken furniture lay in disarray. But there was something organized about it, papers stacked in precise little piles. Chairs turned in perfect angles, as if someone had been careful in the chaos. The walls had been written on in pencil. Repeated phrases, scratched and smudged. She cannot see me. She cannot leave. She will know. Each line was crossed out after being written multiple times. I measured the handwriting. It was small, tight, obsessively controlled. Someone had been here, and they had been meticulous. In the kitchen, I found a small stack of notebooks. The pages yellowed but intact. Each was filled with day-by-day observations of people who had come near the house. Their routines, meals, and conversations were catalogued with eerie precision. One entry described a man who had delivered mail in the neighborhood. He walks the same path every day. I note the pattern. His shirt, the scuff on his shoes. He will not look at the house. Upstairs, the bedrooms were worse. One room had been converted into a makeshift office. A chair sat at a desk, surrounded by more notebooks and photographs. The photos were of people who had lived in Tyler at some point, some familiar from local papers, others seemingly random. Their expressions were ordinary in daylight, but there was a consistency in each one. Eyes slightly averted, lips pressed thin, shoulders stiff. The other room was what the officers referred to as the watching room. Floorboards were scraped bare in places, small gouges in the wood like someone had knelt there for hours. On a low table, I found a cassette recorder and several tapes, each labeled with a date. The earliest was 1999. I pressed play in the room. It picked up faint, breathing and whispering, almost inaudible. Over time, the recordings became obsessive, cataloging each footstep, each sound, each creak of the house. By the final tape, the whispers had turned into something else, a muttering, almost pleading. But the voice was broken, fragmented. The scariest part, though, was the mirror. Not the glass itself, but the placement. In the watching room, a full-length mirror faced the doorway. Anyone entering would immediately see themselves, but it also reflected a portion of the room behind them, where the notebooks, photographs, and floor gouges were. The arrangement suggested someone had been studying not only the people they observed, but also their reactions, how they moved, how they registered their own presence. As I documented the scene, I noticed footprints on the floor, bare, small, and impossibly fresh. I had been alone, and yet the prints led from the stairs directly into the watching room, then vanished into the corner beneath the mirror. When I left, I locked the door behind me. Police later found additional notebooks hidden beneath floorboards, filled with more detailed observations than I had seen. They were addressed to no one, but many pages were labeled, "She knows I am here. I must correct this." The Hollows Tree house has since been boarded up permanently. Residents of Tyler report that even after the windows were covered, shadows move inside at night. Some say they hear faint breathing or whispering when the street is empty. The truth is likely more mundane than paranormal, but the level of obsessive documentation, the way someone studied lives for decades, the careful cataloging of their behaviors, human darkness in its purest form, is what makes this house terrifying. I haven't returned, but I still think about the mirror, the notebooks, and the audio recordings. Whoever lived there, and whatever they planned, was methodical, patient, and horrifyingly meticulous. That kind of evil doesn't vanish when a house is locked or boarded. It lingers in the details, waiting for someone to uncover it. I first heard about the Victorian house on the outskirts of Galveston from a city code inspector named Marcy, who had stumbled upon it while checking abandoned properties for safety violations. She warned me in a hushed tone, "Whatever you do, don't underestimate what people leave behind." That was enough for me to drive out the next morning, armed with my notebook, camera, and an uneasy curiosity I can't explain. The house sat near the edge of an overgrown street, the sort of road where even the streetlights gave up. From the outside, it looked like a classic Victorian, all peeling paint, gingerbread trim, and windows clouded by years of grime. But there was a subtle wrongness to it. The symmetry was off. The roof sagged at an unnatural angle, and the wind made the eaves moan like a living thing. I entered through the front door, which swung open easily. Inside, the smell hit me first: old wood, damp rot, and a sharp metallic tang that made my stomach twist. The living room was cluttered with furniture laid in dust, but it wasn't random. Chairs were placed as if someone had been sitting and watching the doorway, facing inward with meticulous care. On the fireplace mantel were dozens of photographs, some black and white, some recent, all showing the same woman in different rooms, different houses, and different states of sleep. The kitchen was worse. On the counter lay a stack of yellow journals, their spines cracked from use. I opened one and realized they weren't recipes or household notes. They were obsessive logs of a woman's daily life, her routines, her habits, and the people she interacted with. Every page was dated, detailed down to the hour, minute, and location. The handwriting was small, sharp, and consistent. The last entries were written in a trembling hand. "She suspects something. I must be more careful. She cannot leave. She cannot tell anyone." Upstairs, the bedrooms were empty except for one. That room had been converted into what could only be described as a surveillance hub. Cassette recorders, cameras, and handwritten logs filled the space. The walls were covered with photographs, each one capturing moments from inside the house and beyond, including images taken from nearby streets. The attention to detail was staggering. Every photo, every entry, every recording mapped a life like a predator's blueprint. On the desk, I found an envelope addressed to no one. Inside were letters, some typed, some handwritten, detailing threats, manipulations, and instructions. One letter instructed the subject to leave certain items in specific locations around town, almost like a puzzle designed to test compliance. Another described what the observer called lessons in obedience, detailing days spent following the subject, noting body language, and cataloging minor acts of resistance or compliance. I spent hours documenting everything, but I didn't touch the closets, the attic, or the locked doors. Even standing in that house, I felt eyes on me. The sense of being observed was overwhelming, as if the house itself had absorbed decades of meticulous, predatory focus. When the city finally condemned the house, demolition crews uncovered a hidden subfloor beneath the master bedroom. Inside, they found personal belongings, hairbrushes, worn socks, and dozens of personal effects from multiple women over several years. The remains of a man, presumed the house's occupant, were found in a hidden crawlspace beneath the floorboards, along with more journals and cameras. DNA tests confirmed the items belonged to at least 4 different women, all reported missing over a 20-year span. Even now, months after the house was leveled, the story haunts me. The police never fully explained how the man evaded detection for so long, how meticulously he observed, recorded, and controlled his victims. Locals whisper that when the wind shifts along that street, you can almost hear the faint scratch of pen on paper, as though the house's obsessive eye is still watching. The Victorian house was gone, but the record of human darkness it contained, the methodical, patient cruelty, remains imprinted in the town, and in the minds of those who know the story. There is no supernatural element here, no ghosts or spirits. The horror lies entirely in what a human being can do when left unchecked, and how carefully ordinary life can be dissected and controlled by someone whose obsession goes unseen for decades. I first learned about the duplex on the west side of Lubbock through a neighbor who had reported unusual activity, the occasional flicker of lights in a building that had been empty for years, shadows moving behind boarded windows, and a faint smell of decay that crept down the street. The landlord had abandoned the property after a fire inspector condemned it, but no one had lived there since. I arrived on a late autumn afternoon. The sun was low, and the flat Texas plains stretched endlessly in all directions. The duplex sat on a cracked sidewalk, paint peeling, the roof warped from wind and neglect. A faded "no trespassing" sign was barely hanging on one hinge. I approached cautiously, notebook and camera in hand. Inside, the building smelled of damp wood, mildew, and something metallic. The living room had furniture scattered, as though people had left in a hurry decades ago. On the coffee table were stacks of newspapers, all local editions from the late 1990s. Someone had scribbled notes in the margins of the obituaries. Some names were circled, others crossed out. I went upstairs. Each step groaned under my weight. The bedrooms were empty except for one that had clearly been used more recently. On the floor, there were dozens of notebooks, their pages filled with meticulous daily logs. The entries catalogued the movements of neighbors, delivery drivers, and passers-by. One entry, dated only 2 months prior, described in detail a man delivering pizza, his arrival time, the exact location he stepped on the porch, what he said, and the sequence of his gestures. In a closet, I found a box containing small items, hair strands, buttons, a few fingernail clippings, each labeled with a name and date. The labels suggested someone had been collecting personal objects for years. One tag read, "Megan, the 5th of December, 2025. The most disturbing discovery was in the basement. The door was hidden behind an old shelf. Inside, the space had been converted into a surveillance hub. Multiple monitors displayed grainy footage, mostly from the surrounding neighborhood. Someone had drilled tiny holes into walls, allowing cameras to look into living rooms and bedrooms of nearby homes. Tape reels and SD cards were stacked in crates, each meticulously labeled with dates and names. I found a handwritten journal with entries that became increasingly unhinged. The author, a man named Curtis Hargrove, wrote obsessively about controlling the lives of others. Early entries were methodical. They do not notice me. I know their schedules. Later entries described manipulation and fear. She screamed last night, but no one heard. They think they are free. I will teach them otherwise. The most chilling entry was undated and simply said, "If anyone finds this, they are already part of the story. Watch, record, observe. You cannot leave." I left the duplex immediately. When I returned with law enforcement days later, they found more disturbing items, additional notebooks, carefully collected personal effects from residents in the neighborhood, and a series of small cages. Nothing inside, but dust suggested they had been used recently. No human remains were ever found, but DNA analysis from the collected items linked them to multiple missing person reports over the last decade. The building was condemned and sealed permanently. Neighbors reported hearing soft scratching or the hum of electrical devices at night, even though the power had been disconnected years before. The local authorities never fully explained how Curtis Hargrove managed to surveil an entire neighborhood from an abandoned duplex for years without detection. The duplex is gone now, replaced by a small parking lot. Yet the story lingers in Lubbock. People avoid that corner, and the psychological imprint of a human obsession, patient, meticulous, and horrifyingly invasive, remains a reminder that sometimes The scariest things in life are not supernatural, but the darkness humans leave behind in the empty spaces they inhabit. I first heard whispers about the Riverside house from a Beaumont firefighter. I knew casually. He'd responded to a minor flood in the area and mentioned, almost in passing, that an abandoned house along the Neches River seemed off. He didn't explain why, just said, "You should go see it before you write anything. You'll understand." That was all I needed. The house was tucked into a bend of the river, partially hidden by thick willows and reeds. From the road, it appeared almost picturesque, a weathered white clapboard structure with a wide porch and tall windows. But the closer I got, the more wrong it felt. The symmetry was slightly off. The windows didn't line up evenly, and the front steps sagged to one side. The air smelled of damp wood, river silt, and something faintly metallic. I approached cautiously. The front door was unlatched and swung inward with a soft groan. Inside, the living room smelled of decay and mildew, mixed with the faintly sweet stench of something long rotted. Broken furniture was scattered across the floor, but the arrangement was deliberate. Chairs and tables positioned as if they had been waiting for someone, pointing toward the staircase. On the walls, there were dozens of photographs, some faded, some recent, depicting the same man in different rooms, sleeping, reading, or simply sitting. Many of the photos had been taken from above or behind, capturing angles that could only have been achieved by careful observation. In the kitchen, I found notebooks stacked haphazardly on the counter. Each was filled with obsessive entries about local residents, their routines, and their habits. One entry described a couple who rented a nearby cabin for a weekend. They arrive at 6:02 p.m., carry a blue cooler, unpack in a clockwise direction. They do not see me. Later pages detailed, listening to their conversations, through thin walls, recording sounds, and noting inconsistencies in their stories. I went upstairs. The hallway smelled heavier here, like iron and sweat. The first bedroom was empty except for a bed frame. The mattress was missing, but on the floor were neat piles of clothing, shoes, and small personal items. Each pile had a note, taken on the 4th of December, 2019, initials JL. Another note read, "Careful observation, she notices patterns now." The second bedroom was worse. The entire space had been converted into a surveillance hub. Monitors lined the walls, connected to hidden cameras placed in neighboring houses, streets, and the riverbank. Tapes and SD cards were stacked in cardboard boxes. Some were dated decades prior, some just weeks ago. A single journal lay open on a small desk. Its entries were chilling. The author, later identified as a man named Victor Haynes, meticulously documented every person in the neighborhood he observed. He detailed their meals, sleep schedules, conversations, and even emotional responses, noting minute changes in facial expressions or tone. As I studied the room, I noticed floorboards with scratch marks leading toward a small hatch in the corner. I pried it open and discovered a narrow crawl space. Inside were hundreds of personal items, hairbrushes, clothing, letters, and small containers with fingernail clippings and hair. The remains of rodents were scattered, suggesting the space had been undisturbed for some time. Each item was catalogued, labeled, and dated in Haynes's meticulous handwriting. The final and most disturbing discovery was a set of audio recordings. I pressed play on one. At first, I heard ambient noise, footsteps, doors closing. Then a voice, calm, methodical, describing in precise detail the movements of a family, renting a cabin along the river. She poured the water into the glass, set it down on the counter. He checked the lock, walked past the window. I made note of each. The recordings escalated over time, capturing the fear, frustration, and eventual terror of the subjects as they realized someone had been watching them. The last tape was nearly unlistenable, frantic breathing, whispering, and finally, silence. I left the Riverside house immediately. Local authorities later confirmed Victor Haynes had disappeared without a trace years ago. Investigators found the crawl space and its contents during a demolition, but they could not identify all the owners of the collected items. The house was torn down, but neighbors still report strange noises and shadows near the riverbank at night, suggesting someone, or something, is still observing. The riverside house was not haunted by spirits or supernatural forces. Its horror was human: obsession, meticulous surveillance, and control over lives that never noticed they were being catalogued. That is the kind of darkness that lingers, long after walls are torn down and wood rots into the ground. I first heard about the house on Forgotten Lane from a retired Amarillo detective who had investigated disappearances in the area for decades. He didn't want his name used. He only said, "You'll see things in that house you won't forget. It's not the building, it's what humans leave behind." That was enough for me. The street itself is almost invisible from the main road. Forgotten Lane is little more than cracked asphalt bordered by weeds and scrub, stretching into a dry, windswept plain. The house sat at the far end, partially hidden by mesquite and juniper trees. At first glance, it looked ordinary: 2 stories, faded yellow paint, a sagging porch. But the closer I got, the more wrong it felt. Windows were covered in grime and plywood, yet the reflection of the sun in the broken glass made them seem like dark eyes watching. I approached cautiously, notebook and camera in hand. The front door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I was immediately hit by a mixture of smells: mildew, old wood, and a faint metallic tang, like rusted iron. The living room was cluttered but meticulously organized: chairs arranged in deliberate angles, tables pushed against walls, even small piles of paper stacked in precise order. On one wall, dozens of photographs had been pinned: adults, children, couples, all asleep, all unaware they were being observed. The kitchen held notebooks stacked in haphazard piles, but each had clearly been used recently. I flipped through one. Each page recorded the daily activities of neighbors, delivery drivers, and anyone who passed the house. The handwriting was precise, obsessive. One entry, dated less than a month prior. Describe a man delivering pizza. He arrives at 7:03 p.m. Wears a blue jacket, carries the pizza box with his right hand. Steps on the porch, with his left foot first. Later, entries noted minor deviations, with lines of red ink circling the mistakes. Upstairs, the bedrooms were worse. One room had been converted into a surveillance hub. Monitors lined the walls, connected to cameras hidden in the neighborhood. SD cards, cassette tapes, and notebooks were stacked neatly in cardboard boxes. The author, later identified as a man named Elias Rowe, had spent decades meticulously observing lives that didn't belong to him. In another bedroom, I found a catalog room. The floor was littered with small items: hairbrushes, fingernail clippings, shoes, personal effects. Each was labeled with a date and a name. A few items were disturbingly recent: a pair of socks with initials written in ink, hair strands still fresh. On the wall above the items were notes: "She does not see. She does not notice. She will follow the pattern." I discovered a hatch beneath the floorboards, leading to a crawlspace. Inside were more personal effects: small trinkets, letters, photographs, and a skeleton tucked in a canvas bag. The remains had been partially covered with layers of dust and dirt, as if Elias had forgotten about them. Forensic analysis later confirmed the skeleton belonged to a local woman reported missing nearly 20 years earlier. Her personal effects matched several items in the catalog room upstairs. I also found audio recordings. At first, they were innocuous: footsteps, quiet conversations. But the recordings escalated into detailed observation logs. One tape from 2018 described a neighbor's daily routine in chilling specificity: when they woke, what they ate, how they interacted with pets, and even the expression on their faces while brushing their teeth. By the final tapes, the recordings captured the terror and confusion of people who had realized they were being watched, though the sources of the recordings remained anonymous. The house itself seemed to feed the obsession. Windows were arranged in such a way that almost every street corner was visible. Floorboards creaked strategically, alerting the observer when someone entered. Mirrors were placed to catch reflections of anyone in the house. The architecture was ordinary, but Elias had turned it into a machine for studying and controlling human behavior, a predator's laboratory hidden in plain sight. When law enforcement finally condemned the house, they found additional notebooks and tapes buried beneath floorboards. documenting the lives of people who had never been reported missing. The extent of Elias Rowe's surveillance and obsession was staggering, spanning decades, with meticulous documentation of dozens of lives. He had vanished without a trace years before, leaving behind only the house and its horrifying contents. The house on Forgotten Lane has since been demolished, but the stories linger. Neighbors report faint scratching sounds, shadows moving in empty rooms, and the occasional smell of iron carried by the wind. The horror of the house was never supernatural. It was entirely human, patient, methodical, and obsessively cruel. The emptiness of the house amplified the darkness left behind, a reminder that some human obsessions can linger far longer than they, people who create them. Even now, months after the demolition, I find myself thinking of the photographs, the tapes, the journals, and the crawl space beneath the floorboards. The true terror is the realization that someone can spend decades studying, cataloging, and controlling lives from the shadows, and that such darkness is possible without anyone ever noticing. I first heard about the ranch house from a Pecos County Sheriff's deputy, who insisted I take the story seriously. He had responded to reports of strange noises at the property, located 50 miles outside town. No one had lived there for decades, yet the reports kept coming: footsteps, doors creaking, and occasionally, people claiming they'd glimpsed figures moving in the windows. The ranch house sat alone on a wide expanse of scrubland. The air was heavy with dust, the kind that hangs in your throat and clings to your skin. From the road, it looked abandoned but somehow purposeful, like it had been waiting for someone to arrive. A rickety fence ran along the perimeter, rusted and broken. I parked several hundred yards away, knowing that approaching it would be like walking into someone else's private world. Inside, the smell hit first, moldy wood mixed with something metallic, sharp and almost sweet. The living room had furniture scattered but arranged neatly, as if someone had been using it very recently. On the mantel were dozens of photographs, mostly black and white but some recent, showing a mix of families, couples, and lone individuals. Many of the subjects were asleep, unaware they were being observed. The kitchen held notebooks stacked in careful piles. Each page recorded the daily habits of neighbors, delivery drivers, and random visitors to the nearby highway. One entry detailed a man delivering propane tanks, arrival time, clothing, footwear, even his gait. Another entry noted a family picnicking near the property. She laughs at 2:14 p.m. He gestures at the child. Observe response carefully. The entries became more erratic over time, showing clear signs of obsession and increasing paranoia. Upstairs, the bedrooms were worse. One room had been converted into a surveillance hub. Old monitors lined the walls, connected to hidden cameras placed in surrounding areas. Tape reels and SD cards were meticulously labeled with dates and names. A journal lay open on a small desk, chronicling decades of observation. The author, identified later as a man named Samuel Griggs, had meticulously documented the lives of dozens of people over the years, detailing their routines, behaviors, and small deviations from normal patterns. Another bedroom contained what the local sheriff later called a collection room. Personal items, hairbrushes, clothing, letters, and even used items like socks and shoes were arranged in neat rows. Each was labeled with a date and initials. The most recent item had been placed only weeks before my visit: a woman's hairbrush with initials written in ink. Above the collection, a note read, "She does not notice. She cannot leave. Observe closely." The basement was accessible through a trapdoor under the stairs. Inside, crates contained hundreds of items: journals, photographs, and even skeletal remains partially wrapped in canvas. DNA testing later confirmed they belonged to several missing persons spanning decades. Each item was carefully catalogued, as if Griggs had been documenting his life's work. Audio recordings were found as well. At first, they were mundane: footsteps, ambient noise, quiet conversations. Over time, the recordings became obsessive, cataloging every minute detail of the subjects' lives. One tape described a couple renting a nearby cabin. She opened the door at 7:03 a.m., poured coffee, walked to the window. He did not notice me, but I observe. By the final tapes, The recordings captured panic and confusion, and eventually silence. The house itself seemed designed for surveillance. Windows offered lines of sight into surrounding streets. Mirrors reflected areas where cameras were hidden. Floorboards creaked strategically, alerting the observer when anyone entered. The house was ordinary in structure but extraordinary in purpose. A carefully constructed machine for cataloging, controlling, and obsessively studying human behavior. Samuel Griggs disappeared before authorities could apprehend him. The house has since been demolished, but locals report strange occurrences, footsteps, fleeting shadows, and an occasional metallic smell on the wind. The horror of the dusty ranch house is not supernatural. It is human, methodical, patient, and meticulously cruel. Even empty, the house retains the imprint of its creator's obsessive darkness. I first heard about the house on Willow Creek Road from a local paramedic who had responded to a wellness check years ago. He wouldn't go into specifics, only said, "You don't want to go inside that house alone. Whatever's in there, it's not right." That was enough for me to drive out to Waco and see it myself. The house sat at the end of a narrow, winding road, partially hidden by towering willow trees and overgrown brush. From the street, it looked like a decaying suburban home, white-painted wood peeling away in large strips, a sagging porch, and windows darkened with dirt. Yet something about it felt alive. Even in the daylight, it seemed to watch. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and iron, carrying the odd sweetness of long-decayed matter. I approached slowly, notebook in hand. The front door was warped but slightly open. Pushing it, the hinges groaned. Inside, the living room was coated in layers of dust. Yet the furniture was arranged deliberately. Chairs angled as if to watch the entrance. Tables pushed against walls. And newspapers stacked in neat piles. On one wall, dozens of photographs had been pinned. Men, women, and children asleep, unaware they were being observed. Some images were old, yellowed, while others were recent, and all were labeled with dates and initials in tiny, precise handwriting. The kitchen held notebooks stacked on the counter. Each contained meticulous daily records of neighbors, delivery drivers, and anyone passing nearby. One entry, dated 2005. Describe a man delivering mail. He approaches at 8:02 a.m. Wears a blue jacket, carries the bag in his right hand. Observe hand gestures and gait. Later entries became obsessive, cataloging minute changes in posture, tone, and emotional response. By 2018, the entries were erratic, with repeated warnings to the subjects: do not leave. Watch every movement. Upstairs, the bedrooms were far worse. One room had been converted into a surveillance hub, monitors lining the walls, connected to cameras hidden throughout the neighborhood. SD cards, tape reels, and journals were stacked in neat boxes. The author, later identified as a man named Leonard Crenshaw, documented dozens of lives over decades. Each person's habits, routines, and small deviations were recorded with terrifying precision. The second bedroom contained what authorities later called the collection room. Hundreds of personal effects, hairbrushes, worn clothing, letters, shoes, even fingernail clippings, were arranged meticulously. Each item was labeled with a date and initials. A recent item, a small scarf, was still slightly damp, suggesting it had been placed there days before my visit. A note above the collection read, "Observe carefully. She does not see. She will comply." The basement was accessible through a hidden trapdoor. Inside, crates contained more personal effects, journals, and photographs. Among them were skeletal remains wrapped in canvas and partially buried under dust. DNA testing later confirmed that several belonged to missing persons. Over the last 30 years, every item had been catalogued with obsessive care, as if Crenshaw's life's work depended on it. Audio recordings were also recovered. At first, they were mundane: footsteps, the creak of floorboards, muffled conversations. Over time, the recordings became obsessive, chronicling every movement and interaction of the subjects. One tape described a couple renting a cabin nearby. She poured coffee at 7:14 a.m., walked to the window. He did not notice me, but I record. Later tapes captured panic. Fear, and eventually silence. The house itself seemed designed for surveillance. Windows faced every corner of the street. Mirrors reflected areas with hidden cameras. And the floorboards creaked strategically to alert the observer. The structure, ordinary in design, became a machine for meticulous human observation, cataloging, and control. Leonard Crenshaw disappeared before authorities could apprehend him. The Willow Creek house was demolished years later, but neighbors still report strange sounds, creaking, whispering, fleeting shadows in empty rooms. The terror of the house is not supernatural. It is human, methodical, patient, and obsessively cruel. Even demolished, it retains the imprint of the darkness its creator left behind. Even now, months after my visit, I still think about the photographs, the journals, the crawlspace, and the recordings. The horror is in realizing that someone could spend decades watching, cataloging, and controlling, lives without anyone ever noticing, and that this kind of human darkness lingers long after the house itself is gone. I first heard about the farmhouse from a local Lufkin historian who specialized in abandoned properties. She didn't give me many details, only that the place was off limits for good reason. That was enough. The farmhouse sits at the end of a dusty dirt road, surrounded by fields that were once cotton plantations. The air was dry, carrying the faint scent of earth and decaying vegetation. From the road, it looked like a classic southern farmhouse, 2 stories, white wood peeling from years of exposure, and a wide porch with sagging railings. Yet as I approached, I noticed a subtle wrongness. The windows were dark, yet somehow reflected movement that didn't exist. The wind made the eaves moan like a low warning. I pushed open the front door, which creaked ominously. Inside, the living room was coated in thick dust, but furniture was arranged as if someone had been using it recently. Chairs faced the door, tables were aligned in precise angles, and old newspapers lay stacked neatly on the mantel. On the walls, dozens of photographs had been pinned. Women, children, men, often asleep or looking away from the camera. The photos were labeled with dates and initials, some going back decades. The kitchen held notebooks stacked in careful piles. Each contained daily observations of neighbors, travelers, and anyone passing nearby. One entry described a man delivering supplies. He arrives at 8:17 a.m., carries a brown package. Observe gestures and speech patterns. Later entries became obsessive, cataloging minor deviations in behavior, clothing, and even the tone of voice. By the last entries, the handwriting was erratic, with repeated warnings: do not leave, observe, she will comply. Upstairs, the bedrooms were worse. One room had been converted into a surveillance hub. Monitors lining the walls connected to hidden cameras in the surrounding area. Tape reels, SD cards, and journals were stacked meticulously. The author, later identified as a man named Richard Malley, had documented dozens of lives over several decades. Every habit, routine, and deviation was noted, along with personal reactions and emotional states. Another bedroom contained what investigators later called the collection room. Hundreds of personal effects, hairbrushes, shoes, letters, clothing, even fingernail clippings were arranged meticulously on the floor. Each item was labeled with a date and initials. A scarf still faintly smelled of perfume, suggesting it had been placed there recently. Notes on the walls read, "Observe carefully. She does not see. She cannot escape." Beneath the floorboards, accessible through a hidden trapdoor, crates contained more personal effects, journals, photographs, and skeletal remains partially wrapped in canvas. DNA testing later confirmed that several belonged to missing persons spanning decades. Each item had been catalogued meticulously, as if Malley had devoted his life to recording every detail. Audio recordings were also found. At first, they were mundane: footsteps, doors opening, faint conversations. But over time, they became obsessive, detailing every movement and interaction of the subjects. One recording described a family renting a cabin nearby. She makes coffee at 7:14 a.m., moves to the window. He does not see me, but I record. Later recordings captured panic, fear, and eventually silence. The farmhouse itself seemed designed for surveillance. Windows faced every street corner. Mirrors reflected areas with hidden cameras, and floorboards creaked to alert the observer. The house, ordinary in design, became a machine for meticulous human observation and control. Richard Malloy disappeared before authorities could apprehend him. The old cotton farmhouse has since been demolished, but neighbors report strange noises, footsteps, whispers, fleeting shadows at night. The terror of the farmhouse is entirely human, methodical, patient, and obsessively cruel. Even empty, it retains the imprint of the darkness its creator left behind. The photographs, journals, crawlspace, and recordings linger in memory. The true horror lies in knowing that someone could spend decades cataloging, controlling, and observing lives without ever being noticed, and that the darkness of human obsession can persist long after the house itself is gone. I first learned about the Hollow Creek apartment from a retired Denton police officer named Harris, who had responded to a wellness check there in the early 2000s. He was hesitant to talk, staring at me with a kind of weight in his eyes that only comes from seeing the worst humans can do. He said simply, "That place. It wasn't just empty. It was alive with someone's obsession. You go there, you feel it, and it's not safe." That was enough for me to drive the 90 minutes north from Dallas and see it for myself. The apartment complex itself sits at the edge of Denton, near a creek that winds lazily through a cluster of oak trees and abandoned industrial lots. The building was old, a typical multi-story structure with brick walls and peeling paint, balconies rusted and sagging. From the street, it looked abandoned. The windows were darkened by dust, blinds tattered, and the wind made the broken shutters clatter like whispers. Yet there was something in the symmetry of the building, the way the windows stared back like hollow eyes, that made it feel intentional. I approached the apartment carefully. The door to Unit 3B was slightly ajar. The hallway smelled faintly of mildew and dust, but beneath that, there was a faint metallic tang, like rust or iron left too long in the sun. The apartment itself was dim, sunlight filtering weakly through broken blinds. The living room was filled with furniture left in disorder, yet everything was strangely deliberate. Chairs angled as if someone had been observing the entrance, tables aligned to direct foot traffic, and stacks of newspapers on the coffee table with notes scribbled in the margins. On one wall, dozens of photographs had been pinned haphazardly but deliberately, depicting women and men in their homes, at work, or in mundane daily routines. Some photographs were old, faded with time. Others were recent. Every photo had been labeled with a date, a name, or initials, sometimes accompanied by small notes: "Observed sleeping, does not notice. Will continue." The kitchen held a disturbing array of notebooks stacked meticulously on the counter. Each page documented people in the building and nearby streets, their routines, and minute details of their lives. One entry described a postal worker's path down the hallway. She carries mail in her right hand, steps first with her left foot on each stair. Observe pace and cadence. Note any deviation. Later entries documented small deviations in daily habits: someone leaving a window open, a neighbor arriving 5 minutes early, and the author's obsessive responses. Upstairs, the bedrooms were far worse. One room had been converted into a surveillance hub, monitors lining the walls, connected to hidden cameras in surrounding apartments, the street, and even the creek outside. Crates of SD cards, old VHS tapes, and notebooks were stacked meticulously. The occupant, identified later as a man named Philip Kane, had documented dozens of lives over several decades. Every habit, every movement, every subtle emotional shift was recorded in obsessive detail. Another bedroom, designated the collection room by later investigators, contained hundreds of personal items arranged methodically: hairbrushes, worn clothing, shoes, letters, and even fingernail clippings. Each item was labeled with a date and initials. Some items were fresh: a scarf that still smelled faintly of perfume, a pair of socks slightly damp. Notes written on the walls warned: "Observe carefully. She does not see. She cannot escape." beneath a false floorboard. Accessible through a trapdoor was a hidden crawlspace. Inside were crates containing more personal effects, photographs, journals, and skeletal remains partially wrapped in canvas. DNA testing later confirmed that several of the remains belonged to missing persons over the last 25 years. Each item had been catalogued, labeled, and organized with obsessive precision. Philip Kane had also left a series of audio recordings. At first, they were mundane: footsteps, doors opening, quiet ambient sounds. But the recordings became more obsessive over time, chronicling every interaction and movement of his targets. One recording described a couple renting a nearby apartment. She pours coffee at 7:14 a.m., walks to the window. He does not notice me, but I record. By the final tapes, the recordings captured panic, fear, and eventually silence. The apartment itself seemed designed to enhance observation. Windows faced every corridor and neighboring building. Mirrors were positioned to reflect areas where hidden cameras were installed. Floorboards creaked strategically, alerting Kane when someone entered. Ordinary in structure, the apartment had been transformed into a surveillance machine designed for the patient. Obsessive study of human behavior. Kane disappeared before authorities could apprehend him. Hollow Creek apartment was eventually condemned and demolished, but neighbors reported strange occurrences: shadows in empty rooms, soft scratching noises, and a faint metallic smell carried by the wind. The horror of the apartment was entirely human, methodical, patient, and obsessively cruel. Even demolished, it retains the imprint of its creator's darkness. Even now, months after the visit, I still think of the photographs, journals, crawlspace, and recordings. The real terror isn't supernatural. It's the realization that someone could devote decades to cataloging, controlling, and obsessively observing lives without ever being noticed. The darkness Philip Kane created lingers long after the apartment itself is gone. I first heard about the Shady Pines house from a retired Corsicana sheriff's deputy, who had responded to multiple calls regarding suspicious activity there. "It's not just a house," he said. "Whatever went on in there, it lingers. You don't want to go alone." That was all I needed to start my investigation. The house sits at the end of a long, tree-lined lane, partially hidden by overgrown oaks and brush. From a distance, it looks like a typical mid-century suburban home: 2 stories, faded white paint peeling from exposure, a sagging porch, and shuttered windows. But the closer I got, the more unsettling it became. The symmetry was slightly off. The air around it was unnaturally still. And even in daylight, the windows seemed to watch. The smell of damp earth mixed with a metallic tang, like iron left in the sun, drifted on the wind. I approached cautiously. The front door was ajar. Pushing it open, the hinges groaned, and I was immediately hit by the smell of dust, mildew, and something faintly sweet and decayed. The living room was cluttered with furniture that had been left as if someone had been using it recently. Chairs were angled to observe the entrance. Tables were lined precisely along walls, and piles of newspapers lay stacked in perfect order. On the walls, dozens of photographs were pinned: men, women, and children in mundane daily activities, sleeping, eating, walking, but all taken from angles suggesting someone had been watching for hours, days, or years. Many had dates, names, or initials written in small, precise handwriting. In the kitchen, I found notebooks stacked on the counter, some bound in leather, others simple spiral notebooks. Every page detailed observations of neighbors, delivery drivers, and anyone passing the street. One entry described a mailman's routine. He enters at 8:03 a.m. Blue jacket, carries bag in right hand. Steps on porch with left foot first. Observe cadence of steps. Later entries catalogue deviations. Windows left open, keys dropped. Brief exchanges of conversation. By 2019, the handwriting had become frantic, obsessive, with repeated warnings: "Do not leave. She does not know. She must comply." Upstairs, the bedrooms were worse. One had been converted into a surveillance hub, monitors lining the walls, connected to hidden cameras installed throughout the neighborhood. SD cards, cassette tapes, and notebooks were stacked meticulously. The occupant, later identified as a man named Henry Caldwell, had meticulously tracked dozens of lives for decades. Each person's daily habits, emotional reactions, and subtle gestures were noted with obsessive precision. Another bedroom, referred to by investigators as the collection room, contained hundreds of personal items arranged deliberately: hairbrushes, letters, clothing, shoes, even fingernail clippings. Each item was labeled with a date and initials. Some items were recent, clothing still faintly scented, hairbrushes with strands attached. Notes on the wall warned, "Observe closely. She cannot leave. She will comply." Beneath the floorboards, accessible through a hidden trapdoor, a crawlspace contained crates filled with more personal effects: journals, photographs, and skeletal remains partially wrapped in canvas. DNA testing later confirmed the remains belonged to multiple missing persons over a span of 20 years. Each item was meticulously catalogued, suggesting Caldwell had devoted decades to his obsession. Audio recordings were also found. Initially mundane, footsteps, doors opening, quiet conversations, they grew obsessive over time, capturing minute details of behavior and interaction. One tape described a couple renting a nearby cabin. She pours coffee at 7:12 a.m., walks to the window. "He does not notice me, but I record." Later tapes captured panic, fear, and ultimately silence. The Shady Pines house itself seemed designed to facilitate surveillance. Windows faced every street corner. Mirrors reflected areas with hidden cameras, and floorboards creaked strategically, alerting Caldwell when someone entered. Ordinary in structure, the house became a machine for observation and control, for cataloging and manipulating human behavior. Caldwell vanished before authorities could apprehend him. The house was condemned and eventually demolished, but neighbors report occasional shadows, the faint metallic tang on the wind, and the sound of scratching from empty rooms. The horror of the Shady Pines house is human, methodical, patient, and obsessively cruel. Even in its absence, it leaves behind the imprint of darkness that a person can create, a reminder of the lengths obsession can reach when left unchecked. Even months later, I still think of the photographs, journals, crawlspace, and recordings. The terror isn't supernatural. It's the understanding that a human being can spend decades meticulously observing, controlling, and cataloging, lives without anyone noticing, and that the shadow of that obsession can linger long after the house itself is gone. I first heard about the Red Maple house from a Tyler neighbor who had lived nearby for decades. She didn't give me her name, only whispered, "Some houses, they are alive with what people leave behind. That one. Stay away if you value your peace." That was all the invitation. I needed to investigate. The Red Maple house sits at the end of a narrow cul-de-sac, surrounded by towering red maples and thick underbrush. From the street, it appears almost normal, a modest two-story frame, faded red paint, a sagging porch. Yet there's a wrongness to it. The windows are dark, but they reflect movement that doesn't exist. Even in bright sunlight, the house seems to stare. The air carries the faint smell of damp wood and iron, a metallic tang that turns the stomach. I approached cautiously, notebook in hand. The front door was cracked open, just enough to push inside. The living room hit me first, a mixture of dust, mildew, and faintly sweet decay. The furniture was arranged deliberately, chairs angled toward the doorway, tables pushed precisely to the walls, stacks of newspapers laid in perfect order. On the walls, dozens of photographs were pinned, men, women, and children in mundane moments, asleep, eating, walking. Each photograph was labeled with dates and initials. Some faded from decades ago, some recent. Some had handwritten notes in tiny script, observed without notice. She will continue. He cannot leave. The kitchen was worse. Notebooks were stacked on the counters, each documenting neighbors, visitors, delivery drivers, and even people walking along the street. One entry described a UPS driver's approach. Arrives at 9:03 a.m. Carries package in right hand. Steps onto porch with left foot first. Observe gait, observe posture. Later entries noted deviations. A neighbor opening a window too early. Someone locking a car differently than usual. Minor disruptions that Caldwell later identified as they. Author considered significant. By the last entries, the handwriting was frantic, repetitive. Obsessed, do not leave. Observe, she must comply. They cannot escape. Upstairs, the bedrooms were worse still. One had been converted into a surveillance hub. Monitors lined the walls, connected to hidden cameras placed in neighboring houses, the street, and even the nearby creek. Cassette tapes, SD cards, and journals were stacked in neat piles. The occupant, a man named Joseph Caldwell, had meticulously documented dozens of lives over decades. Every routine, every subtle emotional response, every tiny deviation was noted with obsessive precision. Another bedroom, later called the collection room by authorities, contained hundreds of personal items laid in precise rows: hairbrushes, clothing, shoes, letters, fingernail clippings. Each item was labeled with a date and initials. Some items were recent, faintly smelling of perfume, slightly damp, as if placed there only days before my visit. Notes on the walls warned, observe closely. She does not notice. She cannot escape. Beneath a floorboard trapdoor lay a hidden crawlspace. Inside were crates with additional personal effects, journals, photographs, and skeletal remains partially wrapped in canvas. DNA testing later confirmed. Several remains belonged to missing persons spanning decades. Each item had been catalogued meticulously, labeled and organized with obsessive care, showing Caldwell's decades-long obsession. Audio recordings were also found. Initially mundane, footsteps, doors opening, faint conversations, they became obsessive over time, chronicling the minutiae of his targets' lives. One recording described a couple renting a cabin nearby. She pours coffee at 7:14 a.m., walks to the window. He does not notice me, but I record. Later recordings captured fear, panic, and eventually silence. The red maple house itself was designed for observation. Windows faced every street corner. Mirrors reflected hidden camera angles, and floorboards creaked strategically to alert Caldwell to intruders. Ordinary in construction, the house became a machine for surveillance, cataloging, and controlling human behavior with horrifying precision. Caldwell disappeared before authorities could apprehend him. The house was condemned and later demolished, but neighbors report strange occurrences, fleeting shadows, faint scratching sounds, and the metallic scent of iron on the wind. The horror of the red maple house is entirely human, methodical, patient, and obsessively cruel. Even empty, it retains the imprint of its creator's darkness. Months later, I still think about the photographs, journals, crawlspace, and recordings. The true terror is understanding that a human being can spend decades observing, controlling, and cataloging, lives without anyone noticing, and that this obsessive darkness can linger far longer than the house itself. I first heard about the Silent Oaks house from a retired Nacogdoches police detective named Langford. He had been on the force for over 30 years and had seen more than his share of crime. But when he spoke of this house, there was an unusual weight in his voice. He said simply, "It isn't haunted by ghosts. It's haunted by someone who knew exactly how to watch, how to wait, and how to break people without anyone ever seeing it." That was enough to make me drive out to the outskirts of Nacogdoches and see the house myself. The house sits at the end of a narrow, unpaved road, lined by oak trees so thick their branches almost touch, creating a canopy that blocks sunlight and casts long, moving shadows even at noon. From a distance, the house seems ordinary: 2 stories, faded grey paint peeling from decades of neglect, a sagging porch, shuttered windows. Yet there is something unnerving about it. The windows reflect movement that doesn't exist, and even the wind seems hesitant, carrying a faint metallic tang and the subtle scent of decay. I approached cautiously, notebook and camera in hand. The front door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, the hinges groaned, revealing a living room thick with dust, mildew, and the faintly sweet smell of rot. Furniture was arranged deliberately, not for comfort but for observation. Chairs faced the doorway at precise angles. Tables lined the walls in careful alignment. Stacks of newspapers and magazines were placed as though waiting for someone to pick them up. On the walls, dozens of photographs were pinned. Men, women, children, often sleeping or engaging in mundane activities, oblivious to the presence of the camera. Each photograph had a date and initials written in tiny, precise handwriting, sometimes accompanied by notes, observed without notice. She will continue. He cannot leave. The kitchen contained dozens of notebooks stacked meticulously. Each recorded neighbors' and passers-by's habits in painstaking detail. One entry described a man delivering groceries. Arrives at 8:15 a.m. Brown jacket, left foot first on porch. Observe posture, hand gestures. Later entries documented minor deviations. A neighbor opening a window early. Someone locking a car differently than usual. By the final entries, the handwriting had become frantic and repetitive. Do not leave. Observe. She will comply. They cannot escape. Upstairs, the bedrooms were far worse. One room had been converted into a surveillance hub. Monitors lined the walls, connected to hidden cameras in the surrounding neighborhood, nearby streets, and even the forested areas behind the house. Crates of SD cards, VHS tapes, and journals were stacked neatly. The occupant, later identified as Martin Holloway, had spent decades meticulously documenting dozens of people. Every action, gesture, and emotional nuance was recorded obsessively. Another bedroom, labeled by authorities as the collection room, contained hundreds of personal items, hairbrushes, letters, shoes, clothing, fingernail clippings. Each item was labeled with a date and initials. Some were recent, still carrying faint traces of perfume or sweat, suggesting they had been collected days or weeks prior. Notes scrawled across the walls read, "Observe closely. She does not notice. She cannot leave." Beneath a false floorboard, a narrow trapdoor led to a crawlspace. Inside were crates containing additional personal effects, journals, photographs, and partially wrapped skeletal remains. DNA. Testing later confirmed that several belonged to missing persons spanning decades. Each item was catalogued meticulously, showing Holloway's decades-long obsession and careful planning. Audio recordings were also recovered. At first, they were mundane: footsteps, doors opening, faint conversations. Over time, the recordings became obsessive, capturing minute details of daily life. One tape described a couple renting a nearby cabin. She pours coffee at 7:14 a.m., walks to the window. He does not notice me, but I record. Later tapes captured panic, fear, and ultimately silence. The house itself seemed designed for surveillance. Windows faced every corner of the street. Mirrors reflected hidden camera angles, and floorboards creaked strategically to alert Holloway when anyone entered. Though structurally ordinary, the Silent Oaks house had been transformed into a machine for observation, cataloging, and control, where human behavior was dissected with terrifying precision. Holloway disappeared before authorities could apprehend him. The house was eventually condemned and demolished, but neighbors report shadows, the faint metallic smell of iron, and soft scratching in empty rooms. The horror is entirely human, methodical, patient, and obsessively cruel. Even after demolition, the house's imprint lingers. Months later, I still think about the photographs, journals, crawlspace, and recordings. The terror is not supernatural. It is the realization that a human being can spend decades observing, controlling, and cataloging, lives without detection, and that such darkness can persist long after the physical house is gone. I first heard about the Whispering Pines estate from a former College Station police officer named Garrett. He had been called to the property multiple times over the years, sometimes for welfare checks, sometimes after concerned neighbors reported strange noises. He leaned back in his chair when he spoke, voice low, eyes distant. It wasn't ghosts, he said. It was him, and whatever he left behind. It wasn't just stuff. It's alive in a way you won't forget. The estate sits on a sprawling property at the end of a long private drive, lined with pine trees that sway and creak even when the wind is calm. From the main road, it appears majestic, a 2-story mansion with brick walls, ivy climbing the sides, and a wide porch. But the closer you get, the more wrong it feels. The windows reflect movement that doesn't exist. Shadows twist unnaturally even in sunlight. The air smells faintly metallic and sweet, like rust and sugar left to ferment in the heat. I approached cautiously, notebook and camera in hand. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as I pushed it open. Inside, the living room smelled of mildew, old wood, and decay. Furniture was arranged in meticulous order, not for comfort, but for observation. Chairs angled toward the doorway, tables lined precisely along the walls, and stacks of newspapers and magazines were laid out with deliberate intent. On the walls were dozens of photographs, men, women, and children going about daily life, sleeping, reading, walking, often unaware of the camera. Many photos were labeled with dates and initials, and some had small notes, observed without notice. She will continue. He cannot leave. The kitchen contained dozens of notebooks stacked carefully. Each detailed the lives of neighbors, delivery drivers, and passers-by. One entry described a FedEx driver, arrives at 9:05 a.m., carries package in right hand, left foot first on porch. Observe posture, hand gestures, timing. Later entries catalogue deviations, a neighbor leaving the gate open, a child taking a different route home. By the final entries, the handwriting was frantic and obsessive. Do not leave. Observe. They cannot escape. She must comply. Upstairs, the bedrooms were worse. One room had been converted into a surveillance hub. Monitors lined the walls, connected to hidden cameras installed in neighboring houses, streets, and wooded areas. Crates of SD cards, VHS tapes, and journals were stacked neatly. The occupant, later identified as a man named Victor Haynes, had documented dozens of lives over decades. Every routine, every gesture, every subtle emotional change was recorded obsessively. Another bedroom, later labeled the collection room, contained hundreds of personal items arranged in precise order. Hairbrushes, clothing, letters, shoes, even fingernail clippings. Each item was labeled with a date and initials. Some were recent, faintly scented with perfume, slightly damp. Notes on the wall read, "Observe carefully. She does not see. She cannot escape." Beneath the floorboards, accessible via trapdoor, was a hidden crawlspace. Inside were crates containing additional personal effects, journals, photographs, and partially wrapped skeletal remains. DNA testing later confirmed several belonged to missing persons over decades. Each item had been catalogued meticulously, showing Haynes' decades-long obsession. Audio recordings were recovered. At first mundane, footsteps, doors opening, faint conversations, they grew obsessive over time, chronicling every movement and interaction of the subjects. One tape described a couple renting a nearby cabin. She pours coffee at 7:14 a.m., walks to the window. He does not notice me, but I record. Later tapes captured fear, panic, and eventually silence. The estate itself seemed designed for observation. Windows faced every corner of the property. Mirrors reflected hidden camera angles, and floorboards creaked strategically to alert Haynes to anyone entering. Structurally ordinary, the house had been transformed into a machine for observing, cataloging, and controlling human behavior. Haynes disappeared before authorities could apprehend him. The Whispering Pines estate was eventually condemned, but neighbors report shadows in empty rooms, soft scratching noises, and the faint metallic scent of iron on the wind. The horror is entirely human, methodical, patient, and obsessively cruel. Even in its absence, the imprint of his darkness lingers. Months later, I still think of the photographs, journals, crawlspace, and recordings. The real terror isn't supernatural. It's that a human being can spend decades observing, controlling, and cataloging lives without detection, and that this obsessive darkness can persist far longer than the physical house itself. I first heard about Broken Willow Manor from an old Beaumont detective named Fletcher, who had spent decades on the force. He'd responded to dozens of calls about the property over the years, but his voice went flat when he spoke of it. "It's not haunted," he said. "It's something else. Something human, patient, and cruel. That was enough to make me drive out there and see the house for myself. The manor sits at the end of a long, overgrown lane, surrounded by weeping willows whose branches sweep the ground like long fingers. From the road, it appears as an old southern estate, 2 stories, faded white paint peeling in large chunks, a wide porch sagging under time, and shuttered windows. Yet even from a distance, it feels wrong. Shadows twist unnaturally. Windows reflect movement that doesn't exist. The wind is still, but the trees creak and groan in ways that make the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. I approached carefully. The front door was slightly open. Pushing it revealed a living room heavy with dust, mildew, and a faintly sweet metallic smell that clung to my clothes. The furniture was arranged deliberately, chairs angled toward the doorway, tables pressed to walls, stacks of newspapers and magazines laid in perfect order. On the walls, dozens of photographs were pinned, men, women, and children, often asleep, walking, or in the midst of mundane tasks. Every photo was labeled with dates, initials, or short notes, observed without notice. She will continue. He cannot leave. Some images were decades old. Others were startlingly recent. The kitchen held dozens of notebooks stacked meticulously on the counters. Each recorded the habits of neighbors, delivery drivers, and anyone passing the property. One entry detailed a UPS driver's approach, arrives at 8:05 a.m., wears blue jacket, carries package in right hand, steps onto porch with left foot first, observe gait, hand movements, timing. Later entries, catalog deviations, children taking different paths home, neighbors leaving windows open too long, minor changes in routines. By the final entries, handwriting was frantic. Obsessive, do not leave. Observe, they cannot escape. She must comply. Upstairs, the bedrooms were far worse. One had been converted into a surveillance hub. Monitors lined the walls, connected to hidden cameras in the neighborhood, nearby streets, and even wooded areas. Crates of SD cards, cassette tapes, and journals were stacked neatly. The occupant, later identified as a man named William Hargrove, had spent decades meticulously documenting dozens of lives. Every gesture, habit, and subtle emotional response was observed, recorded, and analyzed. Another bedroom, called the collection room by investigators, contained hundreds of personal items arranged with obsessive care: hairbrushes, clothing, shoes, letters, and even fingernail clippings. Each item was labeled with a date and initials. Some were still slightly scented with perfume or sweat, suggesting they had been collected very recently. Notes on the walls read, "Observe closely. She does not notice. She cannot leave." Beneath a false floorboard, accessible through a hidden trapdoor, was a narrow crawlspace. Inside were crates containing more personal effects, journals, photographs, and skeletal remains partially wrapped in canvas. DNA testing later confirmed several belonged to missing persons over decades. Every item had been catalogued meticulously, showing Hargrove's decades-long obsession with control and surveillance. Audio recordings were also recovered. Initially mundane, footsteps, doors opening, faint conversations, they gradually became obsessive, cataloguing every detail of the subject's daily routines. One tape described a couple renting a cabin nearby. She pours coffee at 7:14 a.m., walks to the window. He does not notice me, but I record. Later recordings captured fear, panic, and ultimately silence. The manor itself seemed designed for observation. Windows faced every street corner. Mirrors reflected hidden camera angles, and floorboards creaked to alert Hargrove when anyone entered. Structurally ordinary, the broken Willow Manor had been transformed into a machine for observing, cataloguing, and controlling human behavior with terrifying precision. Hargrove disappeared before authorities could apprehend him. The house was eventually condemned and demolished, but neighbors continue to report shadows in empty rooms, scratching noises, and a faint metallic smell on the wind. The horror is entirely human, methodical, patient, and obsessively cruel. Even after demolition, the house's imprint lingers. Months later, I still think of the photographs, journals, crawlspace, and recordings. The real terror isn't supernatural, It's knowing that a human being can spend decades meticulously observing, cataloging, and controlling lives without detection. The obsessive darkness Hargrove created persists far longer than the physical house itself, and in that sense, it is alive. I first heard about the Ironwood house from a former Galveston County sheriff named Lyle, who had spent decades patrolling the island and responding to strange calls. He leaned back in his chair, voice low, and said, "Some houses, they aren't haunted by spirits. They are haunted by people. And this one? It's worse than most. Whatever he did in there, it left a mark. You'll see it if you go." That was enough to make me drive the 30 miles from downtown Galveston to the far end of the island and see it with my own eyes. The house sits at the end of a narrow, sand-choked road lined with saltbush and wind-blasted oaks. From a distance, it appears ordinary, a 2-story coastal home, grey wood weathered by decades of salt and sun, a sagging porch, shuttered windows. But as you approach, there's a subtle wrongness. The windows reflect movement that doesn't exist. The air carries a metallic tang mixed with the faint sweetness of decay. The wind is eerily still, as if hesitant to touch the house. I approached cautiously. The front door was slightly ajar. Pushing it revealed a living room thick with dust, the air smelling faintly of mildew and something metallic, almost coppery. The furniture was arranged deliberately, chairs angled to face the doorway, tables pushed against the walls, stacks of newspapers laid neatly. On the walls, dozens of photographs were pinned, men, women, and children caught in mundane moments, sleeping, eating, walking, oblivious to the photographer. Each photograph bore dates, initials, and sometimes notes. Observed. She does not see. He cannot leave. The kitchen contained stacks of notebooks and journals, meticulously organized. Each page chronicled neighbors, delivery drivers, and anyone who passed nearby. One entry described a UPS driver, arrives at 9:03 a.m., brown jacket, carries package in right hand, steps with left foot first onto porch. Observe posture, hand gestures, timing. Later entries catalogued small deviations, a window left open too long, a child taking a different route home, a neighbor arriving 5 minutes early. By the final entries, handwriting was frantic. Obsessive, do not leave. Observe, they must comply. They cannot escape. Upstairs, the bedrooms were far worse. One had been converted into a surveillance hub, monitors lining the walls, connected to cameras hidden across the property, nearby streets, and surrounding dunes. Crates of SD cards, VHS tapes, and journals were stacked neatly. The occupant, later identified as a man named Samuel Irwin, had documented dozens of lives over decades. Every routine, gesture, and subtle emotional nuance was observed, catalogued, and analyzed with obsessive precision. Another bedroom, later called the collection room, contained hundreds of personal items laid out methodically: hairbrushes, clothing, shoes, letters, and even fingernail clippings. Each item bore a date and initials. Some were recent, hair still faintly scented, socks slightly damp. Notes on the walls read, "Observe carefully. She does not notice. She cannot escape." Beneath a trapdoor in the hallway, a hidden crawlspace contained crates with additional personal effects, journals, photographs, and skeletal remains partially wrapped in canvas. DNA testing later confirmed several remains belonged to missing persons spanning decades. Every item had been catalogued meticulously, showing Irwin's obsessive decades-long work of surveillance, collection, and control. Audio recordings were also recovered. Initially mundane, footsteps, doors opening, faint conversations, they gradually became obsessive, chronicling minute details of daily life. One recording described a couple renting a nearby beach house. She pours coffee at 7:14 a.m., walks to the window. He does not notice me, but I record. Later tapes captured fear, panic, and eventually silence. The Ironwood house itself seemed designed to amplify observation. Windows faced every corner of the property. Mirrors reflected hidden camera angles, and floorboards creaked to alert Irwin to anyone entering. Structurally ordinary, The house had been transformed into a machine for meticulous surveillance, cataloguing, and controlling human behavior. Irwin disappeared before authorities could apprehend him. The house was condemned and eventually demolished, but neighbors report shadows in empty rooms, faint metallic smells on the wind, and soft scratching sounds in the sand. The horror is entirely human, methodical, patient, and obsessively cruel. Even after demolition, the imprint of Irwin's darkness lingers. Months after visiting, I still think about the photographs, journals, crawlspace, and recordings. The terror is not supernatural. It's human. It is knowing that someone can spend decades observing, controlling, and cataloging lives without detection, leaving behind a darkness that persists far beyond the physical house itself. The Ironwood house, like the other 19 houses before it, is a testament to the terrifying reach of human obsession, patient, methodical, and merciless.